Okay, this is the discussion, second discussion, discussion 2. I realized after I made the videos, the lecture videos, that I actually have to have 2 parts to this discussion. They'll both be short. In the first part, discussion 2A, I want to just give you some ideas about what to think about when you're reading the Epic of Gilgamesh, because hopefully you've all started reading this now, and you're probably kind of wondering what the heck is going on here. So I want to just first of all summarize the story so that everybody is on the same page as to what the story is about, and then I want to talk about some of the themes, what things that you should be looking for, because you're going to write your reading response, your first reading response on the Epic of Gilgamesh, and you might write your context paper on the Epic of Gilgamesh. And so I'm going to give you some ideas for things to think about, things to talk about, things to react to. So in terms of the story, at the beginning of Gilgamesh is half god and half human. He's the king of the city of Uruk. And he's super strong, he's better than everybody else. But he's kind of bored, and so what he does is he goes around and he rapes all the women in his town and he beats people up, and the people of Uruk are like, well, my gosh, we can't stand this guy, we've got to get rid of him. So they go to the gods and they say, can you help us out here? Gilgamesh is killing us here. And so they say, all right, we'll take care of it. And they send a wild man to go to Uruk. His name is Enkidu. And so Enkidu is all hairy and he lives in the wilds with the animals. And he starts to show up and everyone's like, well, who's this wild man? What's he doing? And so Gilgamesh says to the hunter, you're supposed to go catch Enkidu. And so the hunter goes out there and he brings a prostitute from the city, and he has the prostitute lie there naked, and Enkidu comes up and she seduces him, and they have sex. And once they have sex, none of the animals will talk to Enkidu anymore. Nature rejects him. So he goes to the city, and he and Gilgamesh have a big fight, and it's basically a draw, although I think Gilgamesh wins. But he says, here is somebody finally who is a match for me. And so Enkidu and Gilgamesh become best friends, and they decide to go on some adventures. They go to the forest of Lebanon, and they kill Humbaba, the guardian of the forest of Lebanon. They steal a bunch of cedar trees. But then the goddess Ishtar, who is the patron goddess of Uruk, comes and she wants to have sex with Gilgamesh, and he says no, because every other guy you've had sex with, he gets killed. And so she gets angry and she goes to the other gods and she borrows the bull of heaven, this huge giant bull, and sends the bull of heaven to destroy Uruk. And Gilgamesh and Enkidu defeat the bull of heaven. They defeat the gods, basically. But then the gods, to punish them, they give Enkidu a disease and he dies. Well, Gilgamesh is upset that Enkidu is dead, and so he decides to find the secret of immortality. And he hears that there's one person named Per-Napishtim, or Utanapishtim, depending on the translation you have, who is immortal. And so he decides to go he goes on a long trek to find Per-Napishtim, and he finally finds him, and he says to Per-Napishtim, you're immortal, what's the secret? And Per-Napishtim tells him a story, and the story was that the gods were going to destroy the earth with a flood, but one of the gods warned Per-Napishtim that the flood was coming, so Per-Napishtim made a big ark, and he took 2 of every animal into the ark, and he saved all these animals, and then he survived the storm. And then when the gods saw all the destruction they had caused, the gods actually were afraid of their own storm. They ran and hid because the storm was so ferocious. But when they came out, the gods realized that they didn't have anyone to give them offerings anymore. But then they noticed Per-Napishtim was there. And so Per-Napishtim began to offer the gods burnt offerings, and the gods showed up like flies. And the gods are so embarrassed that they have destroyed everything, but then they've left Per-Napishtim alive, that they give him immortality along with his wife. And so basically the gist of the story is Gilgamesh, unless the gods screw up again and do another flood, you're not getting immortality. But Per-Napishtim says, but I have heard there's this plant at the bottom of the ocean that if you get that, it'll give you immortality. So Gilgamesh goes and swims to the bottom of the ocean, he gets the plant, and he comes back up, and he's going back to Uruk he's going to take the plant, he's going to become immortal, but he decides to take a bath in a pool on the way, and a snake comes along and eats the plant. So now Gilgamesh realizes that he's got to be mortal. He's going to have to die someday. And he goes back and he actually becomes a good ruler of Uruk at the end of all this. So that's the story. Okay. I want you to think about several themes, and I'm not going to go into them a lot here. I'm going to go into them in later discussions. But the first is, what is government for? During all this, think about what Gilgamesh is doing and what makes for good government. So just ask yourself that, and ask yourself how it's described in the epic. The second is, there's a really complicated story here going on about cities and nature. And I'll just sort of spoil it for you. There's a huge metaphor in here for the transition from hunting and gathering to cities. Okay? And it involves sex also. So I want you to sort out what all is going on there and really pay attention to how Gilgamesh, as the king of this city, relates to nature, and how Enkidu relates to nature, and what sex got to do with it. And figure out how this is really a big metaphor, okay? Third, Gilgamesh is presented as sort of the ideal man at the beginning, but he's a problem. So I want to think about, what does that mean, that Gilgamesh is sort of the ultimate man, but he's also a problem? And what is it that makes Gilgamesh, presumably at the end of the story, not a problem? So think about, what's the ideal man? And Enkidu is sort of presented as an ideal man. Why is he an ideal kind of man, right? And then, how do women appear? There are two main female characters. Pay attention to them and see how they appear. And because one of the themes we're going to develop in this course is we're going to look at gender at various points in history throughout this ancient world that we're studying. And so I want you to pay attention to how are men and women sort of expected to behave, and what makes them good men or women, or bad men or women, etc. Pay attention to that. And then finally, what are the gods like? Right? The gods are presented, they're not central characters. Ishtar is a central character. But they're not really central characters, but they show up in various ways. And I want you to think about what these gods look like compared to how we think about God in, say, Christianity or Judaism or Islam today, or how Greek gods appear in Greek mythology or things like that. So think about your ideas about what God is, and then compare that to how the gods appear in the Epic of Gilgamesh. So that's what I want you to think about with the Epic of Gilgamesh. I will talk about it more in later discussions before your reading response papers are due, but this will get you started on thinking about what I think might be interesting.